And although the thing that Paul came up with wasn't finger-picking, the thing that he was interested in is how you could have the chords and the melody on the guitar at the same time. Michelle, my belle.
Paul wanted to have a little bit of French in it, so he asked the wife of the guy who introduced Paul to John, could you think of a good rhyme to Michelle and any words to go with it? Paul acknowledged her by actually sending her a check of thanks.
I think Paul would often find just an idea and run with it, and he wouldn't care too much about whether it was authentic or anything like that. Most of it we've been in F major, but John just gives us an F minor chord, and we have that, I love you, I love you, I love you.
They just received MBEs from the Queen for services to music. They've barely scratched the surface.
I was so proud of them. You know, MBE. Then just a week later, they go in and record Michelle.
If you were McCartney himself, you wouldn't like the idea that you're pigeonholed as the ballad writer and John gets to be the rocker.
That's the beauty of the Beatles. They could write anything, and they did.
It's early November in 1965. Pope Paul VI becomes the first reigning pope to visit the United States, addressing the United Nations in New York City. Fidel Castro announces that Cubans are no longer blocked from leaving the island, leading to a mass exodus to the United States. The first episode of The Magic Roundabout is aired on BBC One, and the BT Tower officially opens in London, marking a new era of technological innovation and optimism. Meanwhile, the Beatles, for the first time, are recording an album free of touring or filming commitments. This leads to a sense of freedom where they're able to explore new ideas, including the song Michelle, which was written as a French pastiche. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. With the help of an expert, we examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while our resident musician unpicks the lyrics and music. I'm joined by Beatles expert and music industry insider David Stark, and musician and Fab Four fanatic Dave Bennett. So please, men, subscribe, like and comment to UnBeatled with Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we break down the rubber soul ballad, Michelle. David, when Rubber Soul came out, that must have been quite the departure for the Beatles that we would come to expect.
Well, yes, it was actually, mainly because of the sleeve. I mean, it was an iconic photo image which was kind of stretched, and also the Rubber Soul logo itself was very early psychedelic writing, and I was into art at school, and I couldn't stop looking at this logo and copying it. It was quite iconic and still is. People don't realise that
it's very 60s,
very much
pop art.
And this is in '65. You know, 2 years ahead of The Summer of Love '67, where it all went mad. So the Beatles, as usual, were ahead of the time.
And was Michelle part of that thought process of being ahead of the time?
Well, Michelle...
Different, at least.
Yeah, well, Michelle... last track on side one of the album, and it was a great album. And Michelle, yeah, it was, well, what a wonderful ballad. And for me, it's still up there, along with Yesterday and Let It Be, as one of Paul's great ballads. And
do you remember it striking you at the time as being something a little bit different? It was, you know, play on French.
Well, yes, it was
sounding song.
Having that French. And that was completely new. Oh, it's a Beatles singing in French on one. It was wonderful, and of course, it never became a single in the UK, but it did in other countries, as we'll talk about, and did very well. But
it's such a beautiful sounding song, especially with the harmonies, that you can imagine it being a song that would be touted as a single.
It's a lovely song, beautiful guitar playing, harmonies we'll talk about, and the whole track is only 2.5 minutes, but my word.
Catches you there and then.
It really.
So, Dave, as we said about the song with the guitar playing and the harmonies, what is it that grabs you initially on Michelle, from a musical standpoint? I think it's the chords. So this song began as a party piece that Paul wrote to try and impress girls at parties when he was a teenager. And he was going for this sort of French pastiche, sort of jazzy inspired style. But he was also taking inspiration from Chet Atkins and his finger-picking style. And although the thing that Paul came up with wasn't finger-picking, the thing that he was interested in is how you could have the chords and the melody
on the guitar at the same time. So that's what he had. So he wound up with these chords where the top note is the melody note. So it's like, Michelle, my belle, these are words that go together. So all of the chords are tracking along with the melody, which is quite unusual. And it results in this really weird chord progression. We start on, we're on capo 5, but we start on a C chord, so that's not that weird. But then we have that chord, which a lot of people actually transcribe incorrectly. If you look at notation or cover versions, people often play the far more kind of mellow chord like that. So the actual chord is an F7 with the sharp 9 on top, which is sometimes people call the Hendrix chord. It's a really jazzy, bluesy chord. But it sounds a bit out of place in isolation, so people often make it a minor 7 chord instead, which sounds far more normal, I guess. But yeah, for years I was playing it wrong as well, because all the chord websites say minor 7, but then if you listen closely, it is that weird jazzy chord there, hidden in plain sight.
So do you think Paul McCartney was just letting his fingers move around the neck and finding these chords, and then because it sounded jazzy and a little bit French, he was able to...
I think he was trying to emulate this jazzy style, but as often we see with Paul's writing, when he's drawing from these other styles like jazz or maybe reggae with Obladi Oblada, he's not getting the full idea of the genre. He's got his own interpretation of it. Maybe because he just doesn't know what makes a jazzy chord. So he does something that sounds jazzy to him, and instead you get this very new and fresh idea instead. It's sort of this weird chord that I don't think you'd really find in a jazz tune or anything anyway, but he made use of it. And all of these different weird shapes, and this diminished chord, which he just rides up and down the guitar in that clever little pattern.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you said about Paul, he hears something, thinks it sounds like, let's say, jazz or French, and then he builds around that.
Yes.
And it becomes this, not quite a pastiche, not quite an imitation, but there's some sort of weird middle ground of where Paul, as you said, like Obladi Blada, it's not a reggae song, but it is kind of a reggae song.
It's something new.
Michelle's French,
you can see its origins in there. You know, I think we've all listened to Michelle and thought that sounds kind of jazzy, but it's not jazz. It's this new middle ground, as you said. And I think Paul would often find just an idea and run with it, and he wouldn't care too much about whether it was authentic or anything like that.
So this new idea, this Michelle, bit of a departure for the Beatles songs. We've had hits like 8 Days a Week, as we've talked about in a previous episode. We've had A Hard Day's Night. Michelle's a little bit different. It's a bit of a joke. It's a bit of a moving around the guitar in a different way. That was because in Rubber Soul, for the first time ever, they were free of touring and filming commitments to just be in the studio.
Well, yeah, they just filmed and released Help only a few months earlier in July. So there again, Beatles doing 2 albums a year of incredible songs. You can't imagine it today. But yeah, they were on the top of their game. And as you say, they had a bit more freedom at that time. But then they recorded the album and it was released really quickly, just a few weeks later, in early December ss'O65.
To keep up with the constant need for a next album, the Christmas album.
And not only that, they released Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out as a double A-side single on the same day as the album.
Yeah,
so
wild.
The output was just fantastic.
Crazy, yeah.
But for Rubber Soul specifically, for once, or for the first time, they had time, but also they were letting their influences seep more into their music. Influences from Indian music, from American, we'd call it jangle music now, like Birds and Electric Bob Dylan, but...
Yeah, the album has that kind of mid-Beatles period kind of jangly sound to a degree. And, you know, that's, for a lot of people, that was their favourite period, actually. And with the guitar playing and the harmonies, and it's a classic pop album.
But they were surrounding themselves in a wider culture as well, a bit of poetry, a bit of music, obviously, and art, and Eastern music, and then they were sucking it all in and then putting it out in the way that they knew how. And Rubber Soul then felt feels different.
It definitely did. It was definitely a progression from the Help album, which also had a couple of covers, as does Rubber Soul. But yeah, I loved it as soon as I heard it, and it's still, it's still an album I listen to today.
And while we think of this album as being mid-Beatles, or it's still early Beatles in the grand scheme of what they go on to achieve, they just received MBEs from the Queen for services to music. And what we think they've barely scratched the surface of what they go on to achieve at this point.
I always think, with hindsight, it's easy for us to see this as the middle of the Beatles' career, but it really could have been near the end. If they hadn't done the whole second wind of becoming a studio band and becoming sort of very experimental, they could have just packed up shop when they stopped touring, and they would still be, massively famous, iconic band, but in a different way, a different extent. And this could have been near the end rather than middle.
Well, that's interesting. As you say, what they go on to achieve in the studio, they start leading the way of where music goes. If they'd stopped touring and then maybe not gone to the studio, they might have become irrelevant or old hat, and they might have just become that pop band from the early 60s rather than sort of that pioneering, innovative rock group that we know them also as.
But they were the first pop stars to receive the MBEs, as you say, which happened to be on my 13th birthday in October '65. So, I've still got that in my diary from the day.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I was watching it on telly. Wow.
It was such a big news story then.
It was huge. It was huge at the time.
I guess it was probably almost controversial to give these awards that are usually reserved for, people who are doing something very much in the traditional establishment, and giving them to these kids who scream on stage, which obviously now we think of them as artists, but it was showing how the establishment was finally looking at pop music with regard as this is high culture rather than just teenage noise.
Yeah. Well, with all the backlash to them getting awards, some veterans sent theirs back. Some people said that they were unfit for the award. And what I find funny is they had classic mop tops, really long, but in that mid-60s style of even longer than the 1964 mop tops, almost down to their shoulders. And then John Lennon supposedly got a haircut just for the occasion, but it was still almost down to his shoulders.
It was still long.
Yeah, I find funny.
And that was it. It was great. It was great to see. And as a Beatles fan back in the day, I was so proud of them. MBE, which everyone later also stands for Mr. Brian Epstein, who engineered the whole thing. And so I loved it all. And then just a week later, they go in and record Michelle.
Yeah.
Amongst others.
And as we were saying, the song began as a party piece of a young Paul McCartney playing it to girls, pretending to be a French left bank intellectual, turtleneck wearing, existentialist as they back in the day. But he hadn't finished the song, and John insisted that he finished it for Rubber Soul.
Yeah, well, it was just a throwaway party piece thing they had back then. But John obviously remembered it, and when they needed more songs for Rubber Soul, he suggested that Paul continue writing it. And that's when it evolved, because rather than it being this idea where the melody is on the guitar as a sort of almost finger-picking but not quite guitar piece, although he sticks to the same chords, he abandons any sense of it being finger-picking or the guitar using the melody, and then takes it in a new direction. And we then get John introducing the middle eight as well, second section of the song, where we go to the F minor chord. So most of it we've been in F major, but John just gives us an F minor chord, and we have that I love you, I love you, I love you, which is inspired by Nina Simone's version of I Put a Spell on You, where in the middle eight of that song we have I love you, I love you, I love you. So it's a great example again of Paul had this idea, had been sat there for years, and John came along, not only suggested that he finish it, but helped him finish it as well.
And he helped finish it in a classic Lennon way. Yeah. Where he's used Nina Simone as an influence. It's a little bit bluesy, a little bit desperate sounding, raw, but also it's on one note.
Yeah, true. And it's just a repeating phrase. And I love how, combining major and minor, something the Beatles did quite a lot, but it's not very common in the wider scheme of pop music. And I sometimes think that John, probably his lack of musical understanding probably helped him in those scenarios where Paul would say, oh, it's an F. And he thought, oh, F, then I'll do F minor. And that's not really how key usually works, but here it works perfectly. It gives that dark shade to that section.
And finishing writing it, they had some of the lyrics. I believe he was gonna, because it sounded French, he tried to find a name that fitted it. So Michelle.
Sure.
What rhymes with Michelle? Ma belle.
Well, yeah, that's it. And the story is, which is documented, that Paul, amazingly, he was writing this song when he was 16 or 17 in '59, which is extraordinary anyway. And then John remembers it, and as you say, asked him to finish it. And they, Paul wanted to have a little bit of French in it, so he asked the wife of the guy who introduced Paul to John, called Ivan Vaughan, their mutual friend who brought them together on July the 6th, 1957 at the Walton Fete. And his wife, called Jan, was a French teacher. So Paul knew her, and he asked her, could you think of a good rhyme to Michelle and any words to go with it? And she came up with the French lyrics for that one line. And then Paul acknowledged her by actually sending her a check of thanks, which was probably a good idea back in the day. It's cost him saved him a lot of money years later.
That's good, yeah. So here's a thanks, but also it's a Lennon McCartney.
And I presume not just a check, but a little note to say thank you. That's your contribution.
Yeah.
And they went into the studio. They'd finished it at John's insistence, and they recorded it in about 9 hours. And they do it there and then. And it seems like they record it entirely on overdubs. They're not playing as a full band for this one.
And I think that we're seeing the beginnings of their new approach to recording, where overdubs is the way they go. And obviously that's what eventually allows them to do all this really experimental stuff. Here, you probably could have played this as a band, but you've got a few overdub moments which just add a bit of gleam to it. For example, the acoustic guitar is double-tracked, which you can particularly hear on the stereo versions, 2 different takes in each ear. So it's little moments like that which give it that clean and detailed sound.
And on the guitar, he's got this descending line that slows down, which I believe they took from Edith Piaf.
Yeah.
And it's like a descending...
Well, it's a really common idea, this descending line. It's actually called a line cliche because it's so common, where you just take a minor chord and you just lower the bottom note but keep the rest the same. You'll find it in so many jazz standards. So I feel like, John and Paul were going for this jazz-inspired thing. This idea would have been a very easy idea to pull out and just stick it at the top and stick it at the end of the tune.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed they're playing with a capo, which, for people watching, it's the thing that goes across the neck of the guitar and it changes the pitch.
Yes, yeah. So even though, for example, the first chord is an F chord, I'm actually playing a C shape. So that what would be normally a C, if I took the capo off and played it at the bottom of the neck, that's the same shape, but it's now a C chord. And that is how Paul originally wrote it, because when he wrote this originally as this little party piece, he said it was an instrumental in C. So this is where it would have been. And it was inspired, as I said before, by this Chet Atkins piece, and that piece that inspired it also begins on this C chord. So this is definitely the genesis of the song. Maybe it didn't fit his vocal range down here, because after all, he was originally doing it as an instrumental. So sticking the capo on, taking it up to the 5th fret, just brings it up into his range, perhaps.
But that's something new as well, because if we watch old footage back of the Beatles performing live, The Cavern, Ed Sullivan Show, they're not using capos. So this is
that's a good
something as
point.
well they're experimenting with.
Yeah, there's a few occasions I know where they, perhaps it was a George Martin thing. I know on Yesterday, for example, Yesterday was originally composed in the key of G, but it's performed in the key of F, and they down-tuned the guitar, which is kind of the opposite of using a capo. So perhaps the capo here was another George Martin suggestion saying, oh, Paul, that's way too low in your range, you should move it up, maybe.
I'm also guessing, you mentioned the slowing down at the end. I'm guessing it might have been George Martin who was saying, why don't we just slow it down a bit at the end? You know,
Yeah, that's that nice sort of ease back in.
Yeah.
Which, as I mentioned earlier, they took that from an Edith Piaf song. That's sort of
I've not heard that before, but
she slows down the chorus.
Okay.
So they wanted that idea, which again plays into sort of this idea that it's a French sound.
Yeah.
And Paul's got a nice walking bass line in this, in a classic sort of McCartney style. It's very much a Paul song. We can feel that from the guitars, we believe is him, to the bass. But the guitar solo, we think, is George Harrison.
Yeah, it's a little bit unclear. You know, amazingly, there isn't always perfect documentation for these songs. I guess the workflow was so quick. There wasn't always someone taking photos, taking notes of who played what. But most likely, the guitar part was performed by the guitar solo. Sorry, was performed by George Harrison, and quite possibly composed by George Martin, their producer. And it is quite a sophisticated line, and particularly because the chord progression is so weird, it might have been difficult for George Harrison to write a line over it, so they turned to their resident musical expert, George Martin, and said, can you just compose something over that? So it's quite an acrobatic sort of jazzy line. It feels jazzy, and I feel like George Martin would actually have been more aware of the style than the Beatles, so he would have known what sort of line to write over those chords.
Yeah, it's a really subtle solo. It reminds me of Till There Was You on with the Beatles.
Which of course was also, well, it's effectively a jazz standard, that piece. So
that's a good comparison.
Yeah, it has that true jazz sort of heritage to it.
So we can imagine George Harrison playing the solo in a similar vein to Till There Was You. And just in Michelle, we've got to talk about the harmonies. They're the most striking part of the song for me. 2 3-part harmonies, really showcasing that they were also a vocal group.
Yeah.
They are fantastic.
And they really shine through, and they're carrying a lot of the arrangement, really. There's the guitars, but there isn't an awful lot going on. The percussion, the drums are very set back in the mix. The vocals are playing such a strong role in this song.
And then just moving on to the lyrics, there's not a huge amount to say about the lyrics or to analyse. It's a play on the French-sounding guitar line, Michel, ma belle, and then the line sont les mots qui vont très bien ensemble. That literally translates, or pretty much translates to, these are words that go very well together. So it's the same line, but just in French.
Absolutely.
And as we mentioned, the I love you, I love you, I love you, classic Lennon line taken from Put a Spell on You. But the whole song is...
Yeah, but I'm just having Paul singing that one line in French, probably, added hundreds of thousands of other listeners and fans. I mean, the Beatles singing in French on an album. It was quite a move forward, really.
Yeah. But it was pretty much, Michel was written around this idea.
Yeah.
It sounded French, these are the lyrics.
Yeah.
And it's all a little bit of a joke on that, taking it seriously, but it is written as sort of like a
certainly,
pastiche.
it is a pastiche to an extent, but I believe, I was reading that Paul, back in the day, bumped into the photographer David Bailey, who said, "Oh, nice bit of French work there, quite a joke you're doing there." And Paul was quite upset about that because he said, "No, it's supposed to be a serious song." And so he realised there was that element, but really, and to his credit, it really is. It's a standard. It is a classic song.
And for its release, it was on Rubber Soul. It wasn't released as a single, although it was touted as a possible one, but I think John Lennon vetoed it. However, as you said, because it was a standard, or it sounded like a standard. It was incredibly popular with cover versions straight off the bat.
Yes.
And it was taken to #1 in February 1966 by a band called the Overlanders in the UK.
That's the thing, it got covered, not just by them, by many other artists, but the Overlanders had a #1 in the charts for 3 weeks here. And then it was covered by David and Jonathan, who are actually the songwriters, Roger Cook and Roger Greenaway, who I happen to know very well. So that was their big hit, amongst others. But yeah, so it's been covered by countless artists over the years.
And due to the popularity of that hit by David and Jonathan, America, or Capitol Records in America, started putting stickers on the Rubber Soul albums saying, "Hear Paul McCartney sing Michelle," which is interesting. So, and it got a lot of radio airplay in the US, which shows that it's sort of the lasting popularity and
Well, that's right, and then it's one of the BMI's top performing songs of all time, definitely in the top 50.
Well, they almost had too many singles at this time, too many hit songs. They were writing too many good songs. But I also think Michelle, it doesn't sound like a normal Beatles song. So I think at the time, yeah, I can see why they would be maybe against releasing it as a single. In hindsight, of course, it's a perfect Beatles song, but we're so used to, at the time, I guess they would have been used to their very typical sound, that it was a bit of a departure from that.
Instead of it getting released as a single, as you mentioned earlier, it was Day Tripper / We Can Work It Out as a double A side. So as iconic Beatles singles go, that's a pretty big one.
Yeah, they got some top competition there.
So we didn't lose out on much there. Yeah. But just, Michelle has endured, especially as a Paul McCartney song. He's been known to play it live on many occasions. He played it live in Washington, D.C. shortly after Barack Obama was elected president, and he dedicated it to his wife, Michelle. Also, when receiving the Gershwin Prize for Music, or for Popular Song, sorry, he played it and dedicated it to Michelle Obama, and because of the romantic sentiments of the song, joked that he might get punched out by Barack Obama.
He said I could be the first Beatle to be punched out by a president. But also, he played it in Paris on his recent tour. December 24.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he played it,
Because I think all of us saw him on his recent tour. I would have liked to have heard Michelle. That would have been a curveball.
Yeah.
Sounding a little bit different to what we're used to.
Yeah.
But as you said, it won. BMI recognised it as the 42nd most performed song in the 20th century. Sorry, and it won Song of the Year at the Grammys in 1966. So it's got a resonancy.
And an Ivor Novello Award as well.
And an Ivor Novello Award.
Yeah.
Bob Dylan wasn't a fan though. He said you could hear thousands of them in Tin Pan Alley.
It is a cheesier song. It's a great example of Paul's sentimentality, and I don't think that's what Bob Dylan was all about. And so I can imagine why Dylan wouldn't appreciate it. Didn't have to be rude about it though.
No.
I think Bob will change his mind today, and I wouldn't take anything he says as granted.
He has sort of changed his mind a little bit. I think in the 60s it was such a competitive environment. But this song helped establish Paul as sort of, or what we know as Paul as the balladeer of the Beatles. We think, or some people think, maybe not keen fans, but some people think of John as the rocker and Paul as the balladeer due to the popularity of Let It Be, Michelle, Yesterday.
Yeah.
And he's himself has had a little bit of trouble shaking that image and trying to become a bit of more of or to showcase his rocker aspect and trying to show that John was a balladeer at the same time.
Well, yeah, but Paul can do both quite easily. But I agree that Yesterday, his most famous song, was tucked away near the end of side 2 of the Help album, just after or before Dizzy Miss Lizzy, and and Michelle, end of side 1 of Rubber Soul. So they're kind of letting Paul. Oh, Paul's got his ballad. We'll put it here at the end of the side. And so obviously an important and major contribution to the album, but you kind of think, well, they got all the other songs in ahead of it. So.
Yeah. I think, both of them can definitely write both types of song, and Paul can definitely write a rocker and he can write a ballad.
Oh,
but,
100%.
But I think the most ballady, most sentimental songs always are Paul songs. So yeah, even if he wrote, 30 Helter Skelters, he won't be able to completely shake songs like Michelle and Long and Winding Road and those very heartfelt songs.
And I suppose it's not a criticism that he writes songs, because these are some of the most beautiful songs ever written.
Yeah.
And they're gorgeous and they become
100%,
standards. The reason they're covered. But you can imagine if you were McCartney himself, you wouldn't like the idea that you're pigeonholed as the ballad writer and John gets to be the rocker. It's more of he wants himself reconsidered and how he's remembered and how the Beatles are remembered, legacy.
Well, they could both do both very well indeed. Both
John's Julia is the most sentimental song.
They both
probably in
wrote
the whole
ballads
discography.
and rockers. I mean, that's the beauty of the Beatles. They could write anything.
Yeah.
And they did.
Well, we will talk about Paul's more rockier side with I've Got a Feeling in the next episode. We hope you have enjoyed the show. We're sorry, but it is time to go. Now, make sure to subscribe to UnBeatled on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode. Thank you to David and Dave for joining me. Now, the only thing that's left for you to do is sit back, put on the record, relax and float downstream. We'll see you next time for I've Got a Feeling, the last time John and Paul truly collaborated on a track.